Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Vinod Jayachan. I head the School of Law at Wits University. It is my distinct pleasure as head of school to invite all of you to engage in this debate tonight. And I do know that both our international speakers can hear me. Please indicate if you can. Professor Dershowitz.
Yes, I can hear you very clearly.
And I'm waiting for Professor Dugard's picture to come on. And as soon as it, we will work out the technical hitches on that. But as the head of the School of Law, I'm very pleased to welcome all of you to this very topical debate in the speaker series in the contemporary issues in the Yacoob debates. And I'll explain soon enough why we call it the Yacoob debates once I introduce our facilitator for tonight, Justice Yacoob. I do know that this kind of exercise is difficult enough. I mean, the debate is pretty hot, but the exercise is difficult in the sense that it's been a technologically challenging time. I do know that the transatlantic cable was broken last night, as if to challenge us even more. But at the same time, I'm delighted that such large numbers of persons have turned out to be part of this debate, and perhaps we will have, we are accustomed to in this School of Law discussing issues very robustly, and we expect that tonight's debate will be no less than that. Just a couple of house rules before we begin the whole debate. One, please turn off all your cell phones because they are likely to interfere with the recording systems that we have. Two, for those of you who do tweet, I've been told to tell you that it's hashtag Yacoob debate. I see Professor Dershowitz going to tweet straight away. I'm not sure. And thirdly, there might be one or two people leaving a little bit early. That's not an indication of any of the speakers or the quality of the audience, but just that people might have an appointment elsewhere. So, without much ado, let me introduce our facilitator for tonight, who is Justice Zak Yacoob, who was born on the 3rd of March, 1948, and who became blind at the age of 16 months as a result of meningitis. He's married, and his wife is sitting in the back there, and he's represented by his one daughter. I believe the other son couldn't make it, so it's good to see that he's got support. Justice Yacoob, as we know him, is a visiting adjunct professor at Wits at the moment, and his educational career goes back from 1967 to 1969, where he studied for a BA degree at the University College in Durban, now called the University of Durban Westville, or now called the University of KwaZulu-Natal. Sorry, I'm a little bit behind in that. And from 1970 to 1972, he completed his LLB at then University of Durban Westville. He was admitted as an advocate on the 12th of March, 1973. And during that time as an advocate, he represented many people who were prosecuted for contravening security laws, emergency measures, and other oppressive legislation. He represented victims of unfair evictions and people who were required to pay unfair tariffs. He also represented the Durban Six when they occupied the British consulate in Durban in 1984. He was involved in the Delmas treason trial. And in May 1991, he took silk and he joined the Constitutional Court in February 1998. We're delighted to have someone of his caliber chairing this very important legal debate, and he will soon set out for us the rules of engagement for this debate. But before I hand over to him, I have our two international speakers to introduce to you. And if I had to pick two people most knowledgeable about this subject, which is in fact the conflict, the international law applicable to the conflict in Gaza, I can't think of two more qualified people. Professor Alan Dershowitz is in fact a Brooklyn native, and he has been a former professor at Harvard School of Law since the age of 25. He's been described as Israel's single most visible defender, the Jewish state's lead attorney in the court of public opinion. He has written, taught, and lectured about history, philosophy, psychology, literature, mathematics, theology, music, sports, and if you thought that wasn't enough, even delicatessens. So here's been a recipient of numerous awards, including a Guggenheim Fellowship for his work in human rights, a fellowship at the Center for Advanced Studies of Behavioral Sciences, and several Dean's Awards for his books. And coincidentally, I found this on his website, that he's the subject of 2 New York cartoons. And he's also a New York Times crossword puzzle clue. And he's also part of a Trivial Pursuit question. And if you thought that was not enough, there's also a sandwich named after him in Fenway Park. It's pastrami, of course. Professor Dershowitz, welcome to Wits University.
Thank you so much. I appreciate the nice introduction.
Professor John Dugard is our second speaker. Professor Dugard was appointed as the chair in public international law in 1998 at the Leiden University. He's a graduate of the University of Stellenbosch and Cambridge University, where he received his doctorate. For many years, Professor Dugard has in fact been a professor of law at the University of Witwatersrand, during which time he was dean and director of the Center for Applied Legal Studies, a center which was committed to the promotion of human rights in South Africa and which continues even today. So in many ways, Professor Dugard, I'd say welcome home, and I'm hoping that your picture will soon come on, if technically that's possible for us to sort out.
Well, thank you very much. It's great to be with you, even if you can't see me.
But I'm sure we will hear from you soon enough. Amongst other things, he has been, he's held visiting positions in the United States, in Australia, and in England. And since 1997, he's been a member of the UN International Law Commission. And since 2000, he has been the Special Rapporteur on Diplomatic Protection to the Commission. He's a judge ad hoc in the International Court of Justice, and since 2001, he has served as a Special Rapporteur to the UN Commission on Human Rights, on violation of human rights and international humanitarian law in the occupied Palestinian territory. So welcome to both our speakers. I now hand over to our facilitator for tonight, Justice Yacoob.
Thank you very much indeed for that introduction, and I want to welcome our 2 speakers and start by saying that only my date of birth was mentioned and not those of the others, and therefore I feel emboldened to point out that I'm a very young man compared to both of them. Palestine, the Gaza Strip, the troubles that have been going on there have been the concern of all sensible people throughout the world recently. There has been a great deal of emotion on the subject, and rightly so, because loss of life cannot be taken lightly. This kind of conflict, all of us think, must end. And we want to find, and we always want to look for ways and means of ending it. There's a lot of emotion around the issue, but today we want to try and keep the emotion out of it as much as possible, and we want to confine ourselves to some kind of legal evaluation of the situation in Gaza today, and look to some extent on the way forward. We have 2 speakers who will express different views. The rules of engagement are very clear. In the first place, Professor Dershowitz will start by talking for 10 minutes, expressing his point of view. Professor Dugard will follow for a further 10 minutes, and there'll be 2 minutes each after that in reply. Then we'll have questions. Each question must not last more than 30 seconds, question or comment, and each of our international experts will be given an opportunity to comment on the comment or answer the question. And in the end, Professor Dugard will make closing comments for 2 minutes, and Professor Dershowitz will wind up. These are the terms that all of us have absolutely agreed on. I will say when there is 1 minute left in the longer 10-minute presentations and 30 seconds left in the shorter presentations, but the 30-second people will have no warning at all. They will be stopped in 30 seconds, and that's the end of that. And I am going to be equally careful and equally strict with our international speakers as with the members of the audience. So no quarter will be given and no quarter will be expected. We're discussing a very important issue. We're going to learn a great deal. Professor Dershowitz, you start now.
Well, thank you very much. I really appreciate the opportunity to present perspective to so distinguished an audience with so distinguished participants. I was asked to begin by presenting a little historical context of the events in Gaza. Many of you know this, but I'll just go through it very briefly. In 1937, the Field Commission offered to divide the British mandate into a Jewish state and an Arab state. The Jewish agency accepted, the Arab states rejected. In 1947, the UN created its partition. Again, the Jewish agency accepted, and a year later declared the state of Israel. The Arabs rejected, and all surrounding Arab armies attacked Israel, killing 1% of its population, including many Holocaust survivors. Following the 1967 war, which was commenced after Egypt and Syria threatened a genocidal war against Israel, the Israelis offered to return the captured territory in exchange for recognition and peace, and all the Arab nations went to Khartoum and issued their three famous no's: no peace, no recognition, no negotiation. Then in 2001, Ayad Barak and Bill Clinton offered the Palestinians a state on about 95% of the West Bank and all of the Gaza Strip, ending the military occupation and the civilian settlements with some land exchanges. Yasser Arafat rejected that and began the Intifada, in which 4,000 people were killed. 2008, Prime Minister Ayad Omar offered an even more generous proposal to the Palestinians, which was never responded to. I want to go back briefly, though, to 2005, when Prime Minister Sharon ended the civilian settlements in the Gaza, removed all the settlers, and removed all the soldiers. At that period of time, there was no blockade, and it was certainly possible for Gaza to develop itself freely and independently. To be sure, Israel maintained some security controls to prevent the import of weapons, but between 2005 and 2007, there was no blockade. The response was massive numbers of rockets, which played Russian roulette with the lives of Israeli children and other civilians. The blockade was, and this is very important, the result of the rockets. The rockets are not the result of the blockade. In 2006, the tunnels were first used to kidnap an Israeli soldier, Gilad Shalit, and kill 2 other Israeli soldiers and wound 4 others. That was Israel's first indication that this tunnel warfare was about to commence. Hamas, at about that time, instead of developing itself independently, developed a brilliant, I have to say, a brilliant public relations strategy, though it involved double war crime. Their brilliant strategy was to fire rockets and build tunnels from the densely populated areas of the Gaza Strip. And any of you who've been to the Gaza Strip, as I have, know that there are many empty areas in Gaza between the major cities. But Hamas elected to put their tunnels and fire their rockets from the most densely populated areas, using civilians as human shields. This has been called the dead civilians strategy. Hamas's goal is to induce Israel to engage in self-defense, to fire back. The end result is civilian casualties. But I maintain, and I'd like to hear Professor Dugard's response to this, that the civilian casualties under these circumstances are primarily the responsibility and the blame of Hamas. An example from common criminal law. If a bank robber robs a bank and takes the teller as a hostage and begins to fire from behind the hostage, and the police, in order to prevent killing of some of the bank customers, come in and try their best not to kill the hostage, but in the end do shoot and kill the hostage, who is responsible for that murder? Certainly not the policeman who fired the shot, but rather the person who used the human shield. I think the same is true of Hamas in Gaza. And so the question, when you have an enemy that wants to maximize civilian casualties, both on its own side and on the Israeli side, how should a democracy respond? What can it do? Surely, I think Professor Dugard would agree that Israel has the right of self-defense. It may try to destroy the rocket launchers and it may try to destroy the tunnels from which terrorists come and can kill civilians. Plainly, they have a right to attack such military targets, even if the military targets are in densely populated areas, so long as the rules of proportionality are abided by. The rules of proportionality, though complex, can simply be stated as the military value of the target has to be proportional to the reasonably anticipated civilian casualties. And I maintain that the military targets that Israel has attacked, particularly the rocket launchers and the terrorist tunnels, are extremely important military targets. Indeed, Israeli intelligence had reports just before they went in on the ground to attack the tunnels that there was a massive attack planned through the tunnels, which would have victimized many Israeli civilians. Now, proportionality involves a difficult calculus, and it often has to be made during the fog of war, and mistakes are made. The best evidence that mistakes made is that Israel killed a number of its own soldiers in friendly fire episodes, so mistakes inevitably made. Now, the tunnels could not be destroyed without ground troops fighting in densely populated areas where Hamas chose to place their entrances. You cannot attack the tunnels from the air because Israel doesn't know exactly the route of the tunnels. They do know where the entrances are, but the entrances are often in mosques, and there's a videotape of that, and near hospitals and near schools. So Israel had to send in troops on the ground, knowing to be sure that there would be not only some casualties among their own soldiers, some 63 of them were killed, but also casualties among the civilians that live in the areas near the tunnel entrances selected by Hamas for these tunnel entrances. So I maintain that Israel satisfied the rules of proportionality, that Israel satisfied the rules of distinction, distinguishing between military and civilian targets, and that it did not engage in collective punishment. Their actions were not intended to be punitive in nature, they were intended to be preventive. If Hamas had decided to put their tunnels in the open air areas and fire their rockets from the open areas, there would have been few, if any, civilian casualties. In fact, during the Six-Day War, there were very few civilian casualties because Israel fought enemies who had their military in military areas. But when you fight Hamas, you know there will be civilian casualties because that's what Hamas intends. So that's my case for Israel actions in the Gaza. Now let's turn to the future. If Israel were to be improperly condemned for its self-defense actions, as it was by the Goldstone Report, this will only encourage Hamas to continue to operate its dead civilian strategy, because that strategy works. Israel wins militarily on the ground, but always loses in the court of public opinion, because it's far easier for the media to show dead children and dead women than it is to show the context. In fact, Hamas refuses to allow journalists to photograph rockets being fired or to photograph the entrances of the tunnels in densely civilian areas. So all the public sees are the results, the dead children. To go back to my analogy, all they see is the policeman shooting the hostage. They don't see the bank robber who held the hostage and caused his death. This dead civilian strategy, which is a double war crime, tragically works. And it works because of the Goldstone Committee reports, it works because of the UN Commission on Human Rights, and it works because of the media. And so moving forward, what I think should happen now, obviously, is that Israel should not be condemned for its actions. The world should understand it. Hamas should be condemned. It should be forced to end its dead civilian strategy, which only results in more and more civilian casualties. And if it's not, we're just going to see a recurrence. After the Goldstone Report, everybody predicted there would be a recurrence because Hamas won. And there was a recurrence just a couple of years later. And so I predict here today that if Israel is condemned, if it's brought in front of any international courts, the end result will simply be to encourage Hamas to do what it does, and more civilians will die. What should happen now is that Gaza should be demilitarized, the blockade should end, with exceptions for military rockets and equipment necessary to build tunnels, and Israel and the Palestinian Authority should engage in peace talks toward a two-state solution on the West Bank. And if the Gaza Strip is then controlled by the Palestinian Authority, there could be a complete two-state solution. but Israel should negotiate with, but it shouldn't recognize or legitimate an organization like Hamas, which is really no different from ISIS. Just yesterday, Hamas plane crash was the deliberate murder of 3 Israelis, including 1 American citizen. And you cannot legitimate an organization that engages in kidnapping and murder. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you, Professor Dershowitz, for really a fairly interesting justification of the position. It's taught us a great deal. And we can now begin. We can now listen to.
You will lose us.
To Professor Dugard, who will start now.
Yes, I'd like to know whether I am seen or not.
No.
That may be an advantage.
My wife is just trying to adjust our Skype screen. And will you bear with us? We are in touch with your technicians.
Okay. I haven't started you on time yet.
Yes, please. Good.
Unless we disconnect and connect again, that's all we can do. You phone us again. Okay, I'll disconnect and you connect again.
We're actually going to try something.
Okay. They're going to try and connect and reconnect. Let's give a minute or 2 for that to happen in the hope that things will come right.
No, I don't think that I'm on the screen.
Can they hear you?
Can you hear me clearly?
Yes, we can.
We can hear you very clearly.
I think it's probably best if I proceed. Zak said that it's probably better this way because I'm not as handsome as many other people are.
The point really is that I can't see either of you, so it's
well, let me begin by thanking you for inviting me. Just 2 preliminary comments. I'm not going to comment on the history. I don't want to spend time on that. I don't necessarily agree with Professor Dershowitz's portrayal of the history. Secondly, I'm going to avoid the use of the term terrorism or terrorist because both sides accuse each other of being terrorists. Before I start, I just wanted to say that I think it's important that we have the facts on the table because they do inform the debate. To date, over 2,000 Palestinians have been killed and 10,000 wounded. 67 Israelis have been killed, of whom 3 are civilians. Professor Dershowitz said that I would agree with him that Israel had acted in self-defense. Well, quite frankly, I do not. I know that Israel argues that it was acted in self-defense, and President Obama has supported this, and both houses of Congress have supported this unanimously. It's the only thing that those 2 houses can agree upon. But I think it's important to stress that Gaza is occupied territory. It has been occupied for 47 years. The test for occupation, which is a legal status, is effective control. And Israel is in effective control of Gaza. It controls the land crossings, the sea space, the air space, and it carries out regular incursions into Gaza. So it does have effective control over the territory. Israel disputes this and argues that it is simply a hostile entity, a term unknown to international law. But the general view is that it is occupied territory. The United Nations accepts it, states accept it, the International Committee, the Red Cross accepts it, and even Israel's leading humanitarian lawyer, Professor Yoram Dinetine, accepts that it is an occupied territory. Now, once you accept that it is an occupied territory, it's quite clear that Israel's purpose is not to act in self-defense, but to punish a rebellious, occupied people. In other words, it acts not as victim, as it likes to portray itself, but rather as policeman. I think it would be interesting to look at it in the context of the French resistance during the Second World War. If the French resistance had fired rockets into Germany during the Second World War, we would have applauded the French resistance. But unfortunately, that has not happened in the case of Hamas. In the very nature of occupation, people are going to resist. From time immemorial, occupied people have resisted occupation, they have fought back, and they will continue to do so, whether Israel likes it or not. But whether these parties, Israel and Hamas, or as I've characterized them, the fact is that they're both bound by the rules of international humanitarian law. They must comply with the two cardinal principles of humanitarian law. They must observe the principle of distinction, which means that they should distinguish between civilian targets and military targets in firing rockets and bombarding each other. Secondly, there's the principle of proportionality, which means that excessive force should not be used in the attack. Now, I'm prepared to accept that Hamas is guilty of war crimes in the sense that it has used fired rockets indiscriminately into civilian areas, but of course it has been rather ineffective in this respect because only 3 Israeli civilians have been killed. Israel, on the other hand, has engaged in both indiscriminate firing of rockets and shells into Gaza, and it has done so by using force excessively. Over 2,000 people have been killed, 10,000 injured. There's been extensive damage to property, and the whole Gazan community has been terrorized. Today I received news that the parents of a friend of mine from Gaza had been killed. So this does make one aware of the fact that it is a killing field. Schools have been killed, have been destroyed, rockets have been fired at mosques and at hospitals, and there are also serious allegations of executions by IDF soldiers of Palestinians. When I carried out an investigation into Gaza in 2009, we had the same allegations of people who had been carrying white flags, who had been deliberately and cold-bloodedly shot by members of the IDF. Coming to Israel's defense, which had been eloquently put forward by Professor Dershowitz, namely that Hamas uses human shields, that it places its rocket launchers in built-up areas and not in rural areas. Well, obviously, if it placed its rocket launchers in rural areas, these would be easy targets for Israel and its drones. So it does place its rocket launchers in built-up areas. But whether it does so in a way which exposes the civilian population is not clear. There is no evidence that it does do so, and that is a matter of fact which must be determined by an international judicial tribunal. As far as tunnels are concerned, it seems that the tunnels are used to attack military targets. Recently there was a debate on an Israeli website, Plus 972, in which Israelis made it quite clear that tunnels did not lead to the kibbutzes as President or Prime Minister Netanyahu had stated, but rather they led to military targets. And certainly to date, the tunnels have been used only for military targets, such as the capture of Gilad Shalit, the killing of IDF members. But these are questions of fact, and facts must be determined by an international court, if not by the International Criminal Court, by a special tribunal. I'm told that Israel has been taking photographs of its activities in the Gaza Strip, so presumably it has evidence, and there's no reason why it should present them, not present them to the International Tribunal. So I would say that prima facie Israel is guilty of committing war crimes. I also believe that prima facie it is guilty of committing crimes against humanity because it meets all the requirements for crimes against humanity. Some argue that it meets the requirements for the crime of all crimes, genocide. And on the face of it, there's something to substantiate this, but my own view is that one should not infer a special intent to commit genocide, which is required for the crime of genocide, from outrageous genocidal statements in the Israeli Knesset parliament, or by the number of persons killed, but one should look to what I think is the real purpose of Israel's action, and that is to collectively punish the people of Gaza, to terrorize, intimidate, and punish them. And this is in violation of the Fourth Geneva Convention. It's done so previously by imposing a which was itself a form of collective punishment, and it has added to this by shelling and bombarding Gaza. So, in my view, there's a prima facie case against Israel that it has committed war crimes and crimes against humanity. Coming now briefly to the future, I think that the siege should be lifted. If necessary, international monitors should be employed to monitor the siege, monitor the crossings from both Rafah and areas into Gaza. Secondly, I think it's very important that there should be direct talks between Israel and Hamas, and the United States and Hamas. I find it ridiculous that the United States is prepared to talk to Taliban in Afghanistan, but not prepared to talk to Hamas, and that's only because the Israeli government disapproves of direct talks. Finally, there can be no peace without justice. That means that there must be accountability for those who have committed the international crimes, both in Hamas and Islamic Jihad and in the Israeli government and the IDF. I cannot understand why Israel, if it has all this evidence and claims to be the innocent party, is not prepared to refer the matter to the International Criminal Court or to suggest that an international ad hoc tribunal be set up to hear the case. Instead, Israel and the United States have pressured the International Criminal Court into refusing to exercise jurisdiction. So I conclude by saying that accountability is of great importance in this conflict. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. All right, now we go back to Professor Dershowitz for 2 minutes. And may I just say that there's one issue which he hasn't touched on, which I hope he will. How do you manage the conflict of facts? Professor Dershowitz.
The implications of Professor Dugard's position are very, very dangerous. First, he would give Israel no credit at all for ending the settlements and ending the military presence in the Gaza Strip. That makes it much harder for Israel to accept a two-state solution on the West Bank, where rockets could close its airport and endanger all of its population. Second, he makes the very, very questionable statement that people under occupation are entitled to kill civilians with impunity, and that Israel has no right to self-defense, that it can't defend its children against the Russian roulette of rockets being fired at its schools and school buses. My God, what kind of world would we live in if they engage in such self-defense? I was in one of those tunnels. The tunnel I was in 6 weeks ago exited yards away from a kibbutz kindergarten with 57 children in it. So my challenge to you, Professor Dugard, is are you actually suggesting that Israel had no legal way stopping those tunnels but it simply had to wait for terrorists to come out and risk killing 57 or 570 or 5,700 children? Is that your definition of international law? What would South Africa do if there were tunnels dug under it from Zimbabwe? If rockets were being fired, would it simply say, no, we're not going to do anything? Does the fact that some people think that there's a continued occupation, even though there are no military presence, deny Israel the most fundamental and basic
30 seconds.
Self-defense? Professor Dugard, how would you handle the tunnels? That's my challenge to you. What would you have done?
Is it my turn to respond? Yes.
Yes, you have 2 minutes.
I accept that Israel has the right to destroy tunnels that are being employed not against its civilians, but against its military. I accept that it is entitled to destroy the tunnels, but it does so not in self-defense, but as a policeman that is enforcing the occupation, that is suppressing a revolt by an occupied people. And I think that is where we differ fundamentally. Secondly, as far as my failure to give credit to Israel for withdrawing from Gaza is concerned, I think it's important to stress that Israel simply could not cope with the presence of the IDF in Gaza before 2005, because there were small numbers of settlers in the territory. There had to be a tremendous IDF presence in order to protect the settlers. So it was simply strategically and economically impossible to continue occupying Gaza on the ground. But the fact that it has withdrawn its troops from permanent occupation does not undermine the fact that it remains in effective control by other means, and that is therefore the occupying power, and that it is simply suppressing a revolt from a rebellious occupied people.
Okay, are you through, Professor Dugard?
Yes.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. Now we have 30 minutes in which we will take comments and questions. The comments and questions should not last more than 30 seconds. And I will just raise my hand when the 30 seconds are up, and people must please stop immediately. And Professor J. Chand will point to the people and identify them before they start speaking. Phase one.
Can I start?
Yes.
Quick comment.
There's a microphone.
Quick comment and question. Comment: Israeli authorities have confirmed that no tunnel actually exits closer than 2 miles from any Israeli civilian population center. Question to Professor Dugard in particular: what are the limits of legitimate resistance against the occupation? What is allowed, what is not allowed from a military and civilian resistance point of view?
Professor, who's going to go first? Let Professor Dugard go first this time, and Professor Dershowitz will go next.
As I said in my presentation, an occupied people is entitled to resist the occupation. History shows that this has always been done, and occupied people will continue to resist occupation. But one must bear in mind that in the same way that Israel is subject to the rules of international humanitarian law, so too is the occupied people. It is bound to refrain from firing rockets indiscriminately into civilian areas, however ineffective it may be. So there may be a right to resist, but it is subject to the rules of international humanitarian law.
Professor Dershowitz?
First, let me correct a categorically false statement that was made by the questioner, namely that no tunnel exits are closer than a certain number of miles away from Israeli population centers. The statement can't be true because Israel doesn't know where the exits are. The exits are still secret. They only know where the entrances are. And the several tunnels that they have discovered exits to are much, much closer. The one I was in was merely yards away from a kibbutz, which is a population center. It may not be a city, but it was far less than 2 miles away from the city of Sderot. So that's just a categorically false statement. It's those kinds of statements that are repeated in the media over and over again and repeated in events like this. And second, even Professor Dugard acknowledges that Hamas, even if it were to be considered a rebellious group, occupied, trying to avoid an occupation even though there are no soldiers and no settlements, assuming that's true, he concedes that they can't fire rockets. That automatically gives Israel the right of self-defense against those rockets. And they can't build tunnels to go into Israel to kill Israelis. So Israel has the right to self-defense. You want to call it police action, you want to call it self-defense, it makes absolutely no difference. The only way Israel could stop the tunnels, which Professor Dugard acknowledges they had a right to do, was to send in ground troops. They tried desperately to minimize civilian casualties by giving warnings, by doing knocking on the roof, by making phone calls. But because Hamas put these tunnels in mosques, in schools, in very densely surrounded areas, in order to avoid them being caught by Israel, Professor Dugard is right. If they were put in open fields, then Israel would attack them. But that's what the law requires. It doesn't allow you to put them in densely populated areas in order to avoid attack militarily. Israel had the right to do that. And again, my challenge to Professor Dugard, what would you have done if the only way of closing the tunnels was by sending in ground troops? Would you send in ground troops? Professor Dugard, please answer my direct question.
So the question, as I understood it, was that there was an admission. There was an admission that by the Israeli government, apparently, that there were no tunnel exits sufficiently near civil targets. Now, are you aware of such a statement?
False statement. It's a lie. Sorry, it's a lie. I'll tell you what. I will contribute $100 to your favorite charity if you can find a statement by an Israeli official that says that none of the tunnels had exits within 2 miles of any civilian population. It's false. It's just false. Sorry.
Professor Dugard, I'll give you an opportunity to answer Professor Dershowitz's question.
First of all, I refer to this website in Israel where there was a debate on this matter, and there Israelis stated very clearly that no tunnel exited close to a kibbutz. So it is a question of fact, and I think this should be referred to the International Tribunal. Secondly, as far as how Israel should proceed, it should proceed to close the tunnels, but it should not in the process indiscriminately kill civilians. And Israel has deliberately, I believe, targeted hospitals, schools, and mosques and civilian homes. It has shown no regard for human life. It has behaved in a callous, disgusting manner, and I have no sympathy for the IDF. I carried out an investigation after Operation Cascade in 2009, and I was appalled by the level of destruction that I saw and by the stories that I heard of cold-blooded executions carried out by members of the IDF. I don't think that one should disregard the fact that the Israeli forces have not complied with the laws of war, and they have committed war crimes.
That's your opinion, and that's not based on fact at all. And I was very happy. In fact, I recommended in an article I wrote that there should be an ad hoc investigation, both of Hamas and of Israel, but it shouldn't be done through the UN Council on Human Rights, which is biased, and it shouldn't be chaired by somebody who, before hearing any evidence, has already said that Netanyahu ought to be put in the dock and brought before the International Criminal Court. It should be chaired by somebody like Louis Ocampo, who was the chief prosecutor, formerly the first prosecutor in the International Criminal Court, objective people who have stated no positions, not Professor Dugard, not myself, but people who have never stated any positions on this, not people who have already shown a bias. I think Israel would have nothing to hide. It would expose the falsehoods of cold-blooded murder. If any Israeli soldier ever engaged in a cold-blooded murder, he'd be court-martialed. He'd be brought in front of a court. Some have been disciplined. For every army, there are bad apples. You don't judge a country by what its worst soldier does. You judge a country by how it responds to what its worst soldier does. In Hamas's case, they glorify and name parks after murderers of children, after the Bogle family murderers that killed a group of people in their beds. Is that legitimate self-defense? Is that legitimate opposition to an occupation? No. Israel, according to Colonel Kemp of the former NATO, he said no country in history has ever shown more concern for civilians and has ever done more to avoid civilian casualties than Israel. Israel has done better than my own country, done better than England, done better than NATO. Of course it's made mistakes, but the idea of using words like genocide and words like war crimes is just outrageous and shows a particular bias against the nation state of the Jewish people.
But both of you agree that some kind of dispute resolution mechanism is necessary. The only debate is what that dispute resolution mechanism should be. But you can respond to me after we hear the next comment or question.
Well, could I just ask Professor Dershowitz whether he is in favor of the International Criminal Court exercising jurisdiction, because he has referred to the fact that he supports Luis Moreno Campa as a judge, and he was the prosecutor of that tribunal. I cannot understand why both Israel and the United States so vigorously oppose the International Criminal Court for this matter.
There are three good reasons for that. Let me answer it. Three good reasons. Number one, Palestine has to earn its right to be declared a state and to be recognized by the International Criminal Court as an actual state. The United Nations can't do that through its General Assembly. Number two, if it were brought before the International Criminal Court, Israel would be found to have a completely legitimate legal system, and complementarity would deny jurisdiction to the criminal court to do that. And third of all, I think Israel would be vindicated by any fair and objective evaluation. But when it went before the International Court of Justice, which is not international, it's not a court, and it knows nothing about justice, it precludes Israel from serving on it. Israel has never served on the International Criminal Court. When it did the security barrier case, it barely mentioned the fact that the security barrier had prevented thousands of acts of terrorism. So if you're prepared to present a fair court, I'm prepared certainly to recommend to Israel that it have a fair hearing in front of a fair court. But to be indicted based on the kinds of speculation that you've just set out, of course not. Nobody would ever agree to be put in the dock for engaging in an act of self-defense.
I thought we were not talking putting in the dock. We were talking about how do we resolve disputes of fact. Do you think the International Court of Justice might do that properly or not?
The International Court of Justice has no credibility among scholars, among decent and objective people. It is a disgrace.
As an ad hoc judge on that court, I have nothing but respect for it, and I think it's
and then you must finish. Yeah.
I want to know whether you would be prepared to submit this international court. That is the issue.
No. One at a time. Let's go. Without interruption, please, Professor Dershowitz.
I would say that the International Court of Justice is to justice for Israel what Southern courts were headed by Klan members in relation to justice for the South, or what apartheid courts were in South Africa in relation to black defendants. Israel cannot, under any circumstances, expect to receive justice by that disgraceful institution run by the United Nations, which has shown its bias and bigotry against Israel for the last 10 years. You know that the United Nations has condemned Israel more often than they have Iran, Cambodia. Even during the Cambodian killings, where 3 to 5 million people were killed, there was not one condemnation by the UN, but that was the same year that the UN voted that Zionism was a form of racism. How do you expect Israel to anticipate justice in front of an apartheid court, essentially an apartheid court? I think people of South Africa should realize that there was no justice in South Africa prior to Mandela's release from prison, and there is no justice in United Nations courts when it comes to Israel.
I think, Professor Dugard, you are entitled to one uninterrupted minute on this issue alone.
The court is not a United Nations court. Please answer the question, will you be prepared to submit the matter to the International Criminal Court? And if so, why does Israel and the United States resist it so strongly?
Well, first of all, the United States is not a member of the International Criminal Court, and Israel is not a member of the International Criminal Court, and for very, very good reasons. And the International Criminal Court has not yet proved its credibility to do objective justice. I was invited to speak to the International Criminal Court a few years ago when Prosecutor Ocampo was there, and although he himself was extremely fair and unbiased, I found many of the staff members had very predisposed views regarding the United States, Israel, and the West in general. So my suggestion stands. An objective ad hoc, you used the word ad hoc, Professor Dugard, so I accept it. An ad hoc commission headed by Luis Ocampo, with its members to be picked by people like Luis Ocampo, without anybody who's ever expressed any view regarding the Middle East conflict, international scholars of renown, with an equal claim against Hamas and against Israel. Let them look at the facts and decide whether Hamas has committed double war crimes, whether Israel has acted in self-defense, whether Israel has satisfied the rules of proportionality, distinction, and the opposition to collective punishment. And I'm confident that any fair court would convict Hamas and acquit Israel.
It may be.
I'd be very grateful if you would.
It may be that the answer lies in both parties being persuaded to agree some kind of arbitrator. But really, we must open it up to more comments and questions. Okay? Yeah. John Dugard, I'll give you the opportunity to respond to the last one in a minute, because I think that if you continue responding to each other, we're not going to have comments from the floor, and I want to try and allow that. The next time, I will take Alan's time of response and go to the public. Okay. Any comment?
I have a question for Professor Dershowitz, but before I ask my question, I would like clarification from the facilitator. If a question is permissible on anything Professor Dershowitz said, or is it restricted to the current debate about Gaza?
No, I think it is permitted on anything he said. He said it, and that's it.
Okay. Thank you for that clarification. Professor Dershowitz, your positions, which you explained once more, on the historical emergence of the State of Israel have been challenged by Israeli historians, Benny Morris, for example, who is committed to the Zionist project. Most recently, also in the book by Avid Shleit, I hope I'm pronouncing his name correctly, also committed to the Zionist project, admitting that the State of Israel emerged through a series of acts of ethnic cleansing. Your positions also on the process of negotiation have been comprehensively debunked by Baynard, for instance, in his book on Zionism. So my question simply is, do you continue to maintain that acts of ethnic cleansing were not committed in the process of the emergence of the State of Israel?
Okay. Alan Dershowitz.
So let's be clear, no country in modern history has ever been established in a more lawful manner, starting with the Balfour Declaration, the Peel Commission report, the UN declarations, the League of Nations declarations. Israel was established in 1948, absolutely lawfully. It was then attacked by all the Arab countries. Had it not been attacked, the Arab population would have remained exactly where it was. There would have been no refugee problem, but the Arabs attacked and told their people to leave, and they would come back victorious. About 700,000 or 800,000 left, some under pressure, some voluntarily, some in order to come back victoriously. At the same time, about 800,000 Jews were expelled from Arab countries, from Iraq, from North Africa. There was essentially an exchange of population. No, there was no ethnic cleansing at all. As far as the negotiation posture, just ask Bill Clinton or Hillary Clinton. They both recently made statements saying that it was absolutely Yasser Arafat who unequivocally turned down the opportunity for a two-state solution. You know, Yasser Arafat's untimely death, I call it untimely because if he had only died 4 years earlier, we would today be celebrating the 15th anniversary or so of Palestinian statehood. He was given an enormous opportunity to help his people. The Prince of Saudi Arabia said he committed a crime against the Palestinian people by not accepting the offer at Camp David and Taba by Clinton and Barack. So not only do I stand my position, but I reiterate my position over and over again. If you want to see the documentation in support of it, I have it in the 5 books I've written about this subject with documents and proof that Israel did not engage in any kind of ethnic cleansing. Look, you can find historians in any country that will dispute historical accounts. You can find historians in South Africa that will dispute accounts that Nelson Mandela has made. You will find historians, the question is not what do individual historians say, but what the truth is. And the truth is Israel is established lawfully, but your question is an important one. Because beneath criticism of Israel by many people, apparently like you as well, is not the occupation, it's not the current events, it's Israel's legitimacy as the nation state of the Jewish people. You are challenging Israel's legitimacy as the nation state of the Jewish people. You're shaking your head, saying yes. And that is a non-starter. Israel is not going away. Israel is as legitimate as South Africa, as legitimate as the United States of America, as legitimate as New Zealand, which did ethnically cleanse its population, or Australia, which did ethnically cleanse its population. Israel is here to stay, no matter how much you shake your head.
You have only 5 minutes as a result of the last input. 5 minutes, please.
Thank you for your question.
Thank you for your answer. No.
Professor Dugard, do you have
The next question.
No. You have 5 minutes to respond.
5 minutes to respond. I'd like to respond.
Because to the last question, Professor Dershowitz had 5 minutes, and therefore I want to give you 5 minutes if you want it.
Yes, I do wish to respond. First of all, I think the historians such as Ilan Pape show convincingly that there was ethnic cleansing. So I think the historical record is very clear on that. Secondly, as far as Israel's own system of justice is concerned, Professor Dershowitz has suggested that the principle of complementarity would prevent the International Criminal Court from hearing any dispute. Israel has an abysmal record when it comes to prosecuting crimes committed by the IDF. Take, for instance, the events after the 2008-2009 Operation Cast Lead. 2 reports, or several reports, show convincingly that Israel had committed international crimes. They identified the victims and the assailants, but all Israel did was to prosecute someone for theft of a credit card from a Palestinian. There was no prosecution whatsoever for real crimes. So that was a disgraceful example of Israeli justice. I would like to just comment on the question of occupation. And I think it's very clear that Israel is not only in occupation of Gaza, but it's in illegal occupation of Gaza because it refuses to carry out its obligations. Who is responsible for funding projects in this occupied territory of Gaza? It's foreign donors. Israel has withdrawn its financial involvement and has completely ignored its own responsibility for taking care of an occupied territory. Instead, it has imposed a siege on Gaza, which has left Gaza completely without most basic commodities. And I think one must understand that Hamas's resistance to the siege is the primary reason for this conflict. And I think I should also like to stress that Israel was largely responsible for starting this conflict. You will recall that following the death of 3 Israeli teenagers, Israel embarked upon a savage suppression of Hamas in the West Bank, there was no evidence that Hamas was responsible for that. Israel started the suppression of Hamas in the West Bank, and that sparked off the rocket firing from Gaza. So I don't think it's clear, or it's fair to say that Hamas was responsible for initiating the present conflict.
Okay, so that's another area of disputed fact. But what I wanted to say to Professor Dershowitz is that I don't think anyone ever has said so far that Israel must go away or must be destroyed or anything. I think that we are all agreed in every debate that Israel will stay. In what shape or form and how is a different issue. But I think it's fair to say nobody says Israel must go away. Are there any other comments? Nobody in this meeting has said that, yeah. Nobody in this meeting has said that, and I've not heard any sensible person in South Africa ever say that Israel must go away. So in this audience, that is agreed. Any further comment?
Yes, I have a comment. I have a comment and a question. My comment is first, we started off with saying facts about how many Israelis died and how many Palestinians died. However, my comment is, if it wasn't for the Iron Dome, I think there would be a lot more casualties on the Israeli end as well. So the skewed 67 to 2,000 or so, I think that would be a lot different if Gaza had the same had the same Iron Dome capacities as Israel. And my question is, I understand the principle of distinction, and it's required to distinguish between a military objective and a population, and to direct operations against only military objectives. Military objectives include combatants, which by their nature, location, purpose, make effective contributions to military action. And my question is that if there are rockets being fired out of schools and being fired out of mosques and being fired out of hospitals, for the principle of distinction, wouldn't these be considered military objectives?
Okay, thank you, Professor Dugard first, and I want to restrict each of you in your answers now, please, to 2 minutes so we can get one more question in. Professor Dugard.
Yes, what you see is clear evidence that mosques and schools are being used for rocket launching, then Israel would be entitled to respond, but there is no clear evidence, and that is my objection. I carried out the investigation 2009, and we found no evidence to support Israel's claims, and I suspect that this time round there is still no evidence to support it. But these are matters that should be referred to an international tribunal for investigation. I stand by my view that Israel has acted without regard for civilian life. That accounts for the high number of civilian deaths in the Gaza Strip.
What accounts for the high number of civilian deaths in the Gaza Strip is that Hamas adamantly refuses to allow civilians to use the shelters that it's built. It only allows its terrorists. Yes, I'm using the word terrorists. Terrorists are people who target civilians, children and women, like the Vogel family and like the 3 children who were kidnapped. They're terrorists. Yes, they're terrorists. And Hamas doesn't allow its civilians to use the shelters. Only the terrorists can use the shelters. They want civilians to die. They want them to be killed. And if Professor Dugard, you don't know of any evidence of Hamas, look online. There is a videotape of a tunnel being built from a prayer room in a mosque. There's a videotape on Indian television and French television of rockets being fired from UN, right near UN facilities. If you acknowledge that a mosque that is used to fire rockets is a legitimate military target, then Israel cannot be charged with any violation if it is firing back on targets and abiding by the rules of proportionality, which it is. What people are afraid of are judges like you, Professor Dugard. I would not want Israel to be tried in front of you. You've made up your mind. You say you saw the evidence. Hamas didn't let you see the evidence. The only reason they let you in to look at the evidence is they know which side you're on. If an objective person like Campo came in, they would hide the evidence from him.
Right, thank you very much. Can we have, I think it's got to be the last comment or question with responses, or maybe the second to last.
Those accompanied.
No, speak in front. In front. The one in front.
Professor Dershowitz, you've openly and publicly supported practices such as waterboarding, in other words, torture, in the United States.
Absolute lie.
Understood, but
Hold on.
Can I just finish my question?
Professor, can you allow the person 30 seconds to finish the question? Your 30 seconds start now.
okay, as far as I understand, as far as I've read, you support, under certain circumstances, the use of waterboarding by the US administration in the cases of terrorism. To me, this indicates that you do not respect the fact that there are certain boundaries that cannot be crossed in international relations in terms of human dignity. I'm specifically referring to use Kogan's norms. And I think that it is wrong of you to attack Professor Dugard in terms of his claim that war crimes have been committed.
Professor
I don't
Dershowitz.
think that it's wrong of me to attack you, but I'm about to do that. You have absolutely and categorically lied to this audience. I am opposed to waterboarding. I have led the campaign against torture and waterboarding in the United States. I have been opposed to all forms of torture from the very beginning. I don't know what you're reading or what you're seeing, but the statement of fact you made is categorically and unequivocally false. What I have argued is that if there's going to be any use of these despicable tactics, there should be at least a warrant requirement before they're used. That's my position. Please don't misrepresent it.
Professor Dugard, do you have a comment on that last comment?
I'm not going to comment. I know that Professor Dershowitz has written extensively on the subject of torture and has suggested that torture should be allowed subject to rational restraints. But I don't think this is the issue at present. So I don't want to get into that. But can I comment on something else he said?
Yes, of course.
And that is, he has repeatedly praised Luis Moreno Ocampo, the former prosecutor of the International Criminal Court. I think it's important to realize that Ocampo took 3 years to consider the 2009 Palestinian Declaration accepting the jurisdiction of the court. He could have taken a decision on this matter within 1 month if he was going to reach the conclusion that he reached. I really believe that he was put under tremendous pressure from the United States, as I believe the present prosecutor is. One should not underestimate the influence of the United States in the International Criminal Court and the decision to prosecute. I believe that the present prosecutor could prosecute on the basis of the 2009 declaration, but under pressure from the United States, that is under pressure from Israel, she refuses to do so. And that's what stresses me.
Thank you very much.
What you're saying then is that the International Criminal Court is subject to pressure, political pressure, and that it's not really a court.
I'm not suggesting that.
All right, let's have one more comment, and then we will have John Dugard for 2 minutes. We have 5 minutes left. John Dugard for 2 minutes, and then Professor Dershowitz will end with the final 2 minutes, and I will just say thank you at the very end. So, last comment or question, please.
Professor Dugard, your entire argument's predicated on the blockade, or the so-called blockade by the Israelis of Gaza. But you've selectively ignored the fact that between the period 2005 and 2007 there was no blockade whatsoever. And in fact, the blockade, in your words, only commenced following the indiscriminate rockets which were being fired from Gaza into the civilian population of Israel. Only thereafter did Israel, in your words, become the policeman to effectively monitor or to attempt to monitor or stop the rockets that were coming indiscriminately during the period for which there was no blockade. Could you please answer that?
So each of you will answer the question, comment on the question, and make a final remark. So, for the last time, Professor Dugard, 2 minutes, starting now. Thank you.
Is this my final 2 minutes?
Yeah.
Yes. I think it's important to stress that the blockade has been imposed as a punishment on the entire population of Gaza. That Israel has made no attempt to distinguish between its punishment of Hamas and its punishment of the people of Gaza. And that's why I say that it has engaged in an unlawful siege of Gaza. Its occupation is unlawful. And I think it's important to end on the note that I started on, and that is that Israel has engaged in indiscriminate firing at and shelling of civilian targets, and this is evidenced very clearly by the number of Palestinian deaths and the number of wounded people and the extensive damage to property in the Gaza Strip. I don't think that one can in any way justify Israel's action, and I think that the international community, public opinion in the world outside the United States and Israel is rightly outraged by Israel's behavior, and I do hope that Israel has the opportunity to appear before a proper international court, proper international criminal court, and I'm convinced that it will be found guilty of war crimes and crimes against humanity.
Professor Dershowitz, your last 2 minutes starting now.
The very fact that international opinion is against Israel when Israel has been engaging in an act of self-defense against Hamas that uses human shields and fires indiscriminately and uses tunnels of death, the very fact that public opinion is against them as the result of statements made by Professor Dugard and others is why Hamas is going to continue to do this, why Hamas is going to continue to engage in terrorism, why it's going to continue to kidnap young children and murder them, why it's going to continue to be like ISIS, exactly like ISIS, except that its charter is somewhat worse. The very fact that Professor Dugard won't recognize matters of degree, that Israel did a good thing when it ended its military occupation of Gaza and took its civilian settlements out of Gaza, that he refuses to give any credit to that, makes it impossible or very difficult for Israel to do the same thing on the West Bank. Israel cannot completely ever end military control over its borders. It can never allow tunnels to be dug under its borders. And I say this categorically. No country in the history of the world faced with threats comparable to those faced by Israel has ever complied better with the rule of law, has ever done more to protect civilians, and has ever done more to protect human rights and human liberty. Nor has any government faced with such threats ever had a better judiciary that has held its soldiers accountable. And I challenge you all in the audience to think of any country faced with comparable threats that has done better than Israel. And if that is right, then why, I ask you, is Israel singled out for this double standard? Why, among all the people in the world that are committing such horrendous crimes
10 seconds.
in other places, is Israel the only country that is now suggested to be brought to the court of public opinion and to the courts of law? Answer that question, please.
Thank you very, very much indeed, and I think it behoves us. Firstly, I thank everybody for being here. I want to say to you that refreshments are available outside. I wonder whether Professor Dugard and Professor Dershowitz have any, but we will. And let us end by giving both participants a wonderful round of applause. Thank you very much for everything.